The Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon, Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the Sea of Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But they said to him, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him to the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. So I'll bet you were wondering how I'm going to tie the first reading into everything. Pastor Paul seems to get off on these days. There's going to be one line on the first reading. Pay attention. Everyone is gifted by God. I think that we all believe that. I think we think that's true. But I also think that God doesn't always give us the gifts that we want and we hope for. And we're envious of other people's gifts. And I also believe that we don't always use our gifts to the best of our ability or the way in which God intended our gifts to be used. And here's my line. David today is an example of that, not using his gifts as the way God had intended them for. In the gospel reading, we hear of the feeding of the 5,000, a very familiar story to us. And we hear about this little boy who shared his lunch with the people that were there. And it gets me to think, and I wondered about this boy. He stood out to me as I read the gospel this week. And I wondered about that boy and his story. And so I thought it might be fun to use our imagination a little bit. And I wrote a story about this boy and his perspective and how he might have felt and what he might have seen and what he might have experienced on that day of the feeding of the 5,000. So let's look at this fish story in a different way. And we're going to name the boy Jacob. And we're going to think about him as being 9 years old. In today's terms, that would be going into 4th grade. Now, Jacob lived in a small village named Tiberias. Jacob's father worked in a fish market, and Jacob's mother worked at home to care for the children. Jacob was old enough to know he was poor, but not not yet old enough to care that he was poor. His sandals were almost worn out, and he had a hole in his robe. This particular morning, he got up early because he planned to go with his friend Peter to hear the new prophet that was coming that everyone was talking about. As Jacob was getting dressed, his mom called him to eat at the table. She handed him a sack with barley bread in it to share with Peter if they got hungry on their journey to see this prophet. Jacob's family rarely could afford to buy wheat for this bread, and his mother wanted to save the little they had for the Passover meal. Jacob found Peter waiting outside for him, and they ran to the fish market to go see his father before they headed to the hill of the mountain. The boys loved going to the fish market. They loved the busy and loudness of it, and mostly they loved the great and interesting smells that came out of the fish market. Jacob's father waved them over, and he gave them a couple of fish for their journey to eat if they needed it, and he also said, "Be home before dark." The boys started walking toward the hill, and as they were walking toward the hill, more people were joining them as they were going forward. And the people were talking, and they were telling about these miracle stories. Jacob was excited, but he wasn't sure he could believe everything that he was hearing. As they started up the hill, and at the edge they could see a group of men gathered, and it seemed to be that the prophet Jesus was there as well. And they were talking seriously with each other as the grassy area was getting very full. Jacob noticed that the men started to walk into the crowd, and he could overhear them say, "Does anybody have food to share?" When Jacob heard this, he ran over with his barley loaves and fish, and he gave it to the man. Andrew, the man was, and he was surprised that this boy, who didn't seem that he had much means, gave him this bag of food. Jacob watched as Andrew took the sack of food up to the man called Jesus, and Jesus said something to Andrew, and Jacob's fish and bread were put into baskets. Then the man yelled to the crowd to sit down, and Jesus prayed and gave thanks for the food. And then Jesus' friends started to pass out the food. There should have been enough food for only 5 or 6 people, but the food just kept going and lasting, and they kept passing it. And Jacob kept one eye on Jesus and one eye on the food. Then Jesus began to teach. He talked about loving God and loving one another. Jesus spoke with such passion that Jacob held on to every word that was spoken. And after a while, the crowd became restless. They had seen how Jesus fed them all with a couple of fish and a few loaves, but they wanted some more miracles. Suddenly, Jesus stopped teaching, and they kept everyone and walked farther up the hill. The disciples kept everyone, his friends, kept everyone from following him up the hill. Then the people came over to the boys, Peter and Jacob, and asked them about the fish and bread and thanked them for sharing their food. He was excited to have so much attention, but there really wasn't much that he could say. He certainly didn't understand how his small lunch fed so many people. When Jacob got home, he was surprised to hear that his mom heard this story already and knew that he was a hero of some sort. She asked him why he had given up his food for Jesus' friends instead of keeping it for himself. Jacob said, "I don't know, Mom. He seemed like a nice man, so I just did what I could do to help. I had no idea that my small gift would be so important." His mother gave him a big hug and said, "I am so proud of you." And she put him down and said, "Maybe this Jesus really is the one we've been waiting for." One small gift. One small gift of food from one young boy. And Jesus used it to touch thousands of people. One small gift offered unselfishly, and Jesus provided the means to make that gift more meaningful than one could ever imagine. One small gift. It doesn't matter what your gift or your talent is, God can use you to touch the lives of others. No gift is too small. You are never too young or too old. God is always ready to work in you and through you. Because each of us, when we gather our individual gifts together, when they're brought together, miracles can happen again and again. We see a small portion of all the food and school supplies and different things for people in our community, cleaning supplies. We just see a small part of that. There is so much that came in this last month. It was overwhelming. It was a miracle that will touch other people in the community. It will be a small gift, but God can work through those gifts. God will use our gifts and use us to touch the lives of more people than we could ever imagine. And for this we say, thanks be to God. Amen.